lot of the information and my inspiration for how I'm teaching about shame comes from my dear friend and colleague, Martha Sweezy from Boston, who I have collaborated with on many projects, many writing projects. And so I want to give her credit because I don't give her credit on every slide that she influenced me on. So I just want to say her name out loud. And I think the very first thing that I want to share about is my own journey, why this became so important to me, and why I feel like I want you to really think about it and pay attention to it, and if you can, work with it, because I really do believe that this is the bottom line, that shame and shaming is why couples can't do the thing that they're asking you to help them with. And my belief is that if we stay with the vertical process long enough with any person or any couple, this is what will start to get flushed out, is their shame and their shaming parts and their shamed parts that are getting in the way from allowing them to have the relationships that they want. And I have always given lip service to shame. I mean, I'm a therapist, and I read John Bradshaw, and I believed him, right? But I gave lip service to it because I didn't really want to pay attention to my own, even though I knew that it was lurking in there. And a few years ago, I got some feedback from a friend and a colleague that came at me like a freight train. There was no question about how that person was feeling toward me, and confronted me about some things that I was doing that I was unconscious about. And at the same time, interestingly enough, as the universe would have it, my sister began giving me some similar feedback about something that I do in our family of origin. So it was kind of like, it was just kind of like two freight trains whacking me at the same time. And the feeling, I can even feel it right now as I'm starting to talk to you. And I think I'm feeling vulnerable because of your vulnerable sharing. So it just brought me to my knees. And I thought, I am going to have to deal with this, because the feeling was so horrible that I was so bad. And that I was so bad, and I didn't even know how bad I was. That, and two people that I really cared about, what my part heard, two people that I really cared about were telling me how bad I was. So I got myself off my knees, and I went back to my IFS therapist, and I said, I got to get with this. I have to get with this, because the feeling of being or feeling so shamed, and then shaming myself because that part believed the message, was almost intolerable for me. And so I started that work. And at the same time, the bright light about that is that I was working, Martha was editing a chapter that I was writing for New Dimensions. And that's when we began kind of our camaraderie on, it's all about shame and there's nothing else, right? So I started learning inside and I started learning outside. And the very first thing that I had to do is I had to learn to love the shaming parts of me that were circling my exiles. And that's how it showed up inside, is those protectors that said never again about shame. What came up for me in my work was all of these armored guards that were circling around the parts of me that had so much shame and came out of my childhood feeling so less than. But I couldn't really get to those exiles until I faced that not only did I shame myself, but those protectors took it out. So, it was an outside, inside, outside, inside, outside, inside, and that was the journey for me of really healing these shamed parts of myself is to recognize those loyal soldiers who were doing damage to me and to other people, and to own that, what I do to myself, I do to others as well, even though I don't want to acknowledge that. And that caretaking and codependency and all of those are protectors against shame, and they are actually hurtful to other people. So I've gotten behind this idea of working with shame in relationship and helping therapists start to recognize it and be able to name it and work with it with a lot of courage. What I'm hoping for today, this morning, that your takeaways you'll take away a working definition of shame and shaming. And one of the other things I want you to take away, if you can, is to understand that shame is a verb. It is not a still life. It is not a black blob that sits on top of a part. It is an action that goes on internally. You don't have shame inside without shaming. You got to have both. Not one or the other. I'd love for you to continue to build the muscle that allows you to name it and work with it in couple therapy. And to understand your couple's relational dilemmas, what happens as a result of this shame and shaming parts. And to build confidence to help couples move from I am to it happened. And I'm going to talk more about that in a little bit. But, I am bad, move from I am bad to something bad happened to me. So this is my hope for you in terms of takeaways for today. Okay? So just a little bit about the autonomic nervous system. And I think you asked when I was working with Linda and Susan, what if you say go into your body and they basically say, I don't have a body, which people really do feel like that. Everybody does pretty much have a body, and everybody does have an autonomic nervous system, and that autonomic nervous system is put in place for a really important reason, and it is to help us get out of danger and help us to move away from life-threatening experiences. And I just want to read something about shame in the autonomic nervous system. A couple things. So I really like this, and actually I don't even know where I got it, and it's not written here, but the activation of the autonomic nervous system is part of the brain's overall crisis response, right? The fact that the autonomic nervous system is activated by shame, so we know that the body goes into a reaction during shaming and shamed, suggests that the brain interprets shame as a crisis of some sort. The most likely crisis signaled by shame is a threat to relational bonds, right? So, and all the highly valued resources they contain. So I just want to say that threat in relationship, shame is a huge threat in relationship, shame and shaming. And it can cause the autonomic nervous system to go into their response, which is fight or flight, or shut down and numb and freeze, right? And if we pay attention to how we see that in IFS, we could name those as particular protective parts that go into action, they deploy when there's a huge threat to the relationship during shame or shaming. Does that make sense? Okay. And just another thing, because shame involves the total self, it's a global experience, it's deeply embodied. One blushes, sweats, has a quickened heart rate, yet despite the arousal, one feels bodily frozen, paralyzed, exposed, and unable to escape or hide. The intensity of the autonomic arousal paired with the inability to hide from it, be from oneself or others, makes the experience of shame feel primitive and irrational. Does that make sense to you? If you think about the times that you have You're both heightened and and damped down. So it's a really scary experience. These are my beliefs. Again, you might not agree with this, so that's great. If you don't, that's fine. But I do believe that shame is an emotion like any other. And it's universal. And I want to do just a little experiment with you for a second. So, those of you that have ever felt shamed or humiliated, would you stand up? So look around. Everyone in this room has had that experience, right? Now, only sit down if you have never shamed, criticized, or humiliated yourself. Only sit down if you have never shamed, criticized, or humiliated yourself. And look around. And now, only sit down if you have never shamed, criticized, or humiliated another person. And look around. So, the message here is we are all in this together. No one has never had these experiences of internal or external shaming, okay? Now you may sit down. Shamed and shaming is repairable. But it becomes toxic when it isn't. And I also want to make a caveat for all the parents in the room, because as we talk about what happens to children, you could easily go to shaming yourself, or me, perhaps, which is okay. I'd rather have you do that than do it to yourself. But this is not about parent blaming. There's no child in the whole world that gets out of having the shame and shaming experience. So, as much as we would like to think that we could, so just hold on to those parts. Just make a place inside yourself to hold tight if any of your parts, your parenting parts, start to get activated, and then you feel like you need to shame yourself. The problem with shame becoming toxic, and this is what we see when we start working with couples, is the unrepaired shaming that occurs in early relationships. So shame involves a global negative assessment of one's worth. I did wrong, therefore I am bad. And ultimately, the dilemma becomes, because I'm bad, I'm alone. So as Helen Block Lewis is saying, this becomes extremely primitive in our internal systems, is, if I'm bad and I can't figure out how to get good, this is going to be very dangerous for me, isn't it? Because good keeps you alive and bad gets you exiled. When exiles finally get a voice, we are finally beginning to listen to them. They say things like this: I'm worthless or unlovable. I'm bad. What else do they say? What are the shame statements you start to hear when you are listening to your own exiles, or you're listening to your clients' exiles? What do you hear? I don't deserve. Say it again. Helpless? Yeah. Not good enough. Failure. Alone. Okay. And how do they know this? They were told. Who told them? Someone else. And then what happened? So this becomes the question that we're asking in therapy, which is, how does a bad thing happen become I am bad? And from an IFS perspective, we would say that parts believe the story, fiction becomes reality. Every child is misattuned to. You don't get out of life without having that experience. In IFS, we use the parts language, and parts develop strategies to try to regulate the shame. Right? You with me there? These strategies produce more shame? I'm going to name tons. And you're going to see tons. Because remember the Mike Elkinism, for those of you that know Mike Elkin, protectors get exactly what they're hoping to avoid. Again, shame is not a thing. This is the biggest takeaway I want you to take away. It's not a thing. It's an action. And here is one scenario. This is not the only way that children get shamed and develop shamers, okay? But I just want you to take a peek at these slides. So, does that child look like he's being shamed? Okay. So very quickly, research shows that he now learns how to do that to himself as a way to protect himself. So this is what it means, that a shame protector does not unburden shame. A shaming protector internally does not prevent shame from keeping on rolling in the system. But that's what this part thinks. When we talk to firefighters and we talk to managers, why are they afraid to stop their shaming? You'll feel the shame. I'm going to get to you before anybody else does. And it becomes a moral dilemma internally. You know how to live with this much shame, so I'm going to keep you here. Because if I step back, the world is going to get you. Does that make sense? So when you start working with people with shame, one of the things that you'll hear from the protectors over and over and over again is, I can live with what I've got now. I couldn't live with any more. You know that one, right? Okay. But then also what happens is you are more likely then in your relationship to do to your partner what you do to yourself. Second biggest takeaway that I want you to take away, is that there is no way that you do it to yourself and you don't do it to someone else, or vice versa. And that these shame protectors' job is to make you think that you don't. Right? And here's how Martha and I describe it, that a lot of shame protectors are like vipers. You know what vipers are? They come out, they strike, and they curl back. They can leave the scene without you ever even seeing them, whoosh, like that. And that's what some of those shame protectors are like. And I would say if my husband was in the audience, he'd be rigorously nodding, because I have shame about the shame protector, one of my shame protectors, that strikes out at him. So when he is hurt or confronts that behavior, I say, that wasn't that bad. Can anybody relate? You're so sensitive, that wasn't that bad. And he's like, yeah, the teeth marks are still in my arm. So, it's a really big invitation to hold it lightly and just do a little bit of experimenting with, maybe it's possible that this is true, that what I do to myself, I do to others. So when we start working with couples, when I sit down with a couple and I'm interviewing them, I am listening all the time for this language. I'm not enough, I'm too much, I can't be myself. That's the language of shame in relationship. I'm going to say a tiny bit about shame versus guilt. There is all kinds of research on this. So, but what I want you to take from this is that what I believe is shame is about me. Shame is about me. Guilt is about you. So if I'm feeling guilty, I'm not going to cut myself off from making a repair with you. If I am totally in shame, I'm probably going to make you the problem, right? So when people say they feel guilty, I always want to hear just a little bit more about that. I feel so guilty I can't face them. I say to myself, not so much. I want to know if that's really guilt or if it's shame. Does that make sense to you? Okay, so question it. If somebody tells you they're feeling, embarrassed or guilty, find out, what is that? Is that guilt or is that actually shame? Because if you're working with shame, then you have to go down a little bit. And believe it or not, what I believe is that guilt is a step toward healing. That we want to move people from shame to guilt and to guilt and remorse, because that will move people toward repair. One person experiences shaming inside or out. They become self-focused. This is just what we're talking about, because I want out of this feeling. It's intolerable, and I want to get out as fast as I can. And I do all kinds of things, including rage or blame you. I put myself on a little program of watching when I was feeling bad, watching how quickly I wanted to find somebody to blame. I encourage you to do it, because it was amazing. I walk into my barn and things are out of order and I can't get things done as fast as I want to, and I'm going to be late for this or that, and I want to find who did this to my barn. Who can I find to make responsible for my bad feeling? And, it's a interesting experiment, especially if you're living with an intimate other, because they're usually the one that is triggering a deep, vulnerable feeling, and then they're a great target for your protectors. When you want to blame someone else, just take a breath and see if you can listen to what's going on deeper. Just a little experiment. The minute you want to criticize somebody, judge somebody, or maybe even shame somebody, see if you can quickly do a U-turn and find out, what are you really feeling about yourself first, okay? And prone to disconnect, and I think that's what we mean by a-relational, because shame is all about relationship. It happens in relationship, it heals in relationship, but when we're in this cycle, we are prone to pull out. And we are apt to become relationally dangerous, actually. The very thing that we do to take care of ourselves when we're feeling shame, when we're unconscious, can be very dangerous to another person. Common shame protectors, and you'll probably come up with many of your own: anger, blame, and grandiosity in a relationship is often coupled with withdrawal over responsibility and avoidance. Perfectionism is another shame protector. Chronic criticism, fantasy, overdoing of any kind, firefighting of any kind can often be a shame protector. Caretaking and rescuing can also be a shame protector, and as I said, can be really harmful. And the belief of a protective part that shame only equals more shame. No point in going to shame, because it's only going to bring more shame upon us. I'm going to make a generalization that this is so very true in the world of men. You can validate me or not, that being vulnerable, not acceptable. So I know how to deal with the closed off experience that I have. And I know how to deal, I learned very young how to deal with, feeling shamed, get a PhD. I'm not going to open that up. No, there's no point in going there. And, if we had lots more time, we could unpack this whole, gender difference also. But Brene, I got to give a real shout out to Brene Brown. She has really brought this to the masses, and this idea of the difference between men and women and what women do to men, quite frankly. So, and when you're working with heterosexual couples, it's something to remember. IFS is such an incredible process for working with shame, because we're going to work with the shamers and the shamed. And we're not going to hold that either one of those is more important than any other, right? So a self-compassionate stance is what makes deep healing possible. The compassion of self-energy is inherently shame regulating. And, there's a Buddhist psychologist, Kristen Neff, who's doing all kinds of research on the power of compassion, psychological healing. And then, so we say, if self-compassion is the antidote, then IFS has the answer, right? Because what we're doing is asking people to unblend from the shamed and shaming parts and learn to love those parts of yourself. Learn to love those parts of yourself. So it holds a significant key, we say here, because the other key is being able to be in relationship with your vulnerability. So, and you can see that it's the journey of couples, and it's a painful place that they can't get to because of shame, is being able to bring all of who they are to their partner and still feel loved and accepted and known. So that is, when we talk about the journey, that is the journey. So it's not just inner healing, it's outer healing as well. I just want to say something about us and you. And I think it takes a lot of courage to be able to start, for some of us, to begin to start naming it and saying the word shame. We're shamephobic in our community. I really believe that. And that it's very scary for some of our parts to name that what we're hearing and seeing is shamed and shaming. We have parts that believe if we start naming this, what's going to happen? We'll be shaming. And that's the very thing that your clients' protectors say to themselves. And this is one of Helen Block Lewis's contributions too, is her talking about how if we don't name it, it becomes way worse for the client because they'll turn on themselves. So, how important it is, it's because if you bring it up and your client gets triggered, you can work it out relationally. So we want to bring shame into conscious awareness, because a lot of people, like me, when I was confronted, I didn't know that my part was so hurtful, this part of me. So making it safe to bring shame and shaming into conscious awareness. And being able to help people differentiate between these disowned parts. In another language, it might be working with a shadow, really working with those parts that live in the shadow and that we want to deny, avoid, pretend don't exist. And of course, self-compassion, which leads to self-forgiveness, which leads to internal security, which leads to affect regulation. The last thing that I want to invite to you is the countertransference around shame. Countertransference around shame, that you will have parts of you in your unconscious that will want to block the process of healing shame. And a big one are the rescuers and caretakers. I notice another thing, which is anxious parts that want to kind of hurry up the process. Let's get you out of pain really quickly. So maybe in your practice groups this afternoon, but for sure in your offices, I would encourage you to start paying attention to where you might be hearing little messages of shame coming up and your impulse to try to get it to go back down. You can only take your clients where you're willing to go yourself, right? So go there.